Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. We started a little bit early this morning. I have a fantastic guest, a fan favorite, with me, Alex Krainer. And just to give his bio, I think the audience knows who you are, but just as a force of habit. Alex Krainer is founder of Krainer Analytics and creator of iSystem Trends Following. He has worked as a market analyst, researcher, trader, hedge fund manager since 1996. He's authored several books, including Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, The Grand Deception, and Alex Krainer's Trend Following Bible, and a damn good geopolitical analyst in his own right. How you doing, man? You doing okay today?
I'm doing well, Jamal. Thank you for having me. Good to be with you again.
No, thank you for joining me. I'm curious on your take, just to step into this, on the 12-day war between Iran and Israel. We have discussed this once before, and I don't remember your take originally. I don't know if you thought that they wouldn't do this because it was irrational to do it, but obviously they did it. They attacked Iran in the middle of quote-unquote negotiations. I think I've said before, I never really believed those negotiations were real. And those negotiations ultimately weren't real. Surprise attack, internal, external, even though they kept claiming it was about nukes, ultimately it was a regime change operation that they weren't able to accomplish. And within 12 days, Israel was effectively screaming for a ceasefire. Trump gets involved, does an attack. I strongly suspect that that attack had more to do with a warning of stop, our client can't keep going. In which case Iran did their own theatrical attack, in which case it came to a close under what they're calling a ceasefire. Give me your take just as a general overview, and we can step into it from there.
I think there are still a few plausible explanations about everything that happened. So it's not clear to me which one of them is correct, but what we know now is that this attack was being planned since September or October of last year, so before Donald Trump came to the office. And it's obvious why. You know, the name of the game always has been regime change. And you need regime change if you want to secure your hegemony in the region. And I think that last time I was on your podcast, we talked about why hegemony is important. Ultimately, it boils down to colonial plunder. Mm-hmm. And if governments who wish to use their nation's resource wealth to improve life in their own country, to use those resources to the benefits of their own people who want to be sovereign in how they govern themselves, well, then they are automatically an enemy of the Western Empire, and they have to be eliminated. Iran's nuclear program was always simply the pretext, let's call it a palatable justification for intervening, because, you know, the Western media have been so saturated for so long about Iran's nuclear program. It's almost like that thing, vaccines are safe and effective. You know, it's one of those things being repeated to the point where most people don't even question it. But I question, what is the problem with Iran having a nuclear program? What's the problem exactly? They have a sovereign right to it. Right. And under international law, right? They are a signatory nation of a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Up until now, they have fully cooperated with the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. They've been, let's call it reasonably transparent and dramatically more transparent about their program than Israel ever was, right? Completely non-transparent, and has between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads. And then everybody has to understand that Iran making itself a nuclear threshold state, meaning they don't have a nuclear weapon, but they have set themselves up so that they can produce one on short order. And the reason why they would do that is not because they're evil, but because having a nuclear weapon is widely regarded as, it's not widely regarded, it factually is a deterrent. It's a deterrent. So if your enemy, the country that wants to take you down, that wants to destroy you, that wants to regime change you, has between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, well, then having a nuclear weapon is a deterrent. So if you want to prevent the other side from ever even considering launching a nuclear attack on you, then you want to have a nuclear weapon yourself.
Right.
So Iran has a fatwa against nuclear weapons because their leadership, their theocratic leadership, decided it was un-Islamic. And we have to explain that because many people are repeating this thing about fatwa. They don't really understand what it is. In Islam, killing a non-combatant, killing an unarmed person, an innocent, is not allowed. I know that sounds strange because we've got also inured to these, MI6 CIA version of Islam where they just kill people willy-nilly if they look them sideways.
Yeah.
Under true Islam, killing non-combatants is not allowed. This is why a nuclear weapon is not allowed as a weapon of war. But at the same time, they don't want to allow themselves to be destroyed. So, as a matter of deterrence, they made themselves a threshold state. Okay, so now that's the kind of like the foundation of the situation. Now, what is Donald Trump's role in all this? So obviously, the decision to attack has been made maybe 7, 8, 9 months before. It has been thoroughly planned and prepared. And the structures of government, the structures of, the how do you call it, the intelligence services, the special forces, the spy networks involved in this are all there. They're all still there. They didn't disappear the day Donald Trump walked into the White House.
Right.
And so obviously this was going to go ahead. Now, my question is whether Donald Trump learned about all this and wasn't able to stop it. I remember when in the early days of negotiations between the Iranians and the Trump administration, that Witkoff returned once from Oman, thinking he had a deal because the Iranians agreed not to enrich uranium, to cease uranium enrichment beyond 3.75% or whatever that number is.
Yeah.
And so it was only going to be for peaceful purposes. So they are giving up nuclear weapons. And so Witkoff thought, okay, that's a deal. We got it. And then, as soon as he got back to New York, they wanted his head on a pike and Pete Hegseth. So I think that at that point, Trump probably realized that he can't hold these people back. And so I think that one possibility is that he let it happen to see what happens. Because what was unknown, the objective was regime change. Israelis had all these regime figures marked for assassination.
Right.
So I think that Trump wanted to let it happen, see the consequences, and then, if the regime falls, he climbs up, declares victory, and says look at what we've done. That horrible regime is no more, and I was in charge of it all along, and I made this happen, and so forth. The second possibility, which I consider more likely, is that he didn't want a regime change. but he had to let the Israelis run their operation. And then he took charge, meaning, okay, I got to go against Iran. I can't get away with not intervening. And so they called up the Iranians directly, indirectly. I don't know how exactly that happened. And they told them, look, we can't hold these people back. We're going to have to bomb your nuclear program. You have 2 or 3 days to prepare yourself, evacuate what you need to evacuate. And then we're going to be done with it. It's going to be one thing, we're going to declare victory, and it's done, and then we go on with other things. So that's what happened. And I didn't really think the attack was going to happen, because remember, he said, I'll decide in 2 weeks, and then 3 days later, he was bombing. So I thought that he was going to really decide in 2 weeks, and then I thought, if there's an attack, it's going to be a fake one. And we're going to know that it was going to be fake by the way Iranians react. Because if the Iranians launch a fake retaliation, then it's clear that it was prearranged, that it was a choreographed act of war, so that every party could then go back to their corners, declare victory, and by Trump claiming that they completely obliterated Iranian nuclear program, what he's done, he's removed the justification for war.
Right there.
So if he removes the justification for war, then you can't go to war again. And then they immediately went into planning further negotiations. Trump explicitly said, no, I don't want a regime change. It's messy. These people are capable people. They're good tradesmen. They're good businessmen. They got a lot of oil. We want to go in there and do deals, right? That makes sense to me, for 2 reasons. Yeah, Iranians really have a lot of oil and a lot of potential in terms of economic development, whereas the Israelis are completely a liability. There's nothing to gain there other than giving Netanyahu another few weeks or months of political life. But it's all cost. Israel is just picking wars with every single neighbor, escalating, making things increasingly uglier. And it always falls back on the United States to come and bail them out for no gain whatsoever. So that's why I thought that Trump is probably trying to find a way to get out of a real war in the Middle East in order to do deals that are economically advantageous to the United States and that don't involve warfare, regime changes, and all this nonsense. But now, we have complications, because even though he has done all that, he has said, I don't want a regime change. I want to lift sanctions from Iran. I think that the Zionist fringe in the United States and in Israel understood that they got shafted. And so immediately they started, no. The nuclear program was not destroyed. It was not destroyed. We don't know where the uranium is, because they want to go back to war.
Right.
And it seems to me that this week, so what are we now? 30th June, Monday. That this week, the Israelis are planning further attacks on Iran. And so it looks like the situation is going to get out of control. Trump is going to find himself again in very deep dilemmas about how to act, and he can't take Iran's side. Politically at home, he cannot take Iran's side. He has to take Israel's side, but he has to also try to make it the least damaging to the United States as possible. So it's going to get complicated. But, in a nutshell, that's my take.
I agree with most of it. I have to be honest with you, though. I don't believe a word that ever comes out of Trump's mouth. He's a bad
Oh
liar.
yeah. I'm not saying that any part of, and I think, in fact, Jamal, I think that him being as promiscuous with the truth as he is actually, even if his intentions are good, they have very short legs. Because like,
Yeah.
if you launch into a lie, we obliterated the nuclear program, then immediately there's going to be a reaction saying, like, no, you didn't. So you
Yep.
should say, we think we did, but now we have to send teams of investigators to establish, and we're going to pressure the Iranians to allow investigators in. And you gain weeks. Like this, his lie like fell face down flat in a matter of hours.
Yeah. It's wild to me because his lies on some level give you some context to the truth because he's a bad liar. I agree. The reason why I agree with a lot of what you say, for one, when Trump said 2 weeks, I did a video and said attack is imminent. I was like, he's going to do it immediately. And the reason I thought that is because of the chum that was being put out into media. It was like JD Vance comes out and it's like, oh, I don't want to get involved in a war. It's like, okay, well, that's weird. At what point did you not want to get involved in a war? You've been putting assets in the Middle East for the last several weeks. It's just bizarre. And, once before, when Donald Trump tried to lull them into a sense of false security, okay, well, it just came across as more of the same in that sense. I agree with you that I don't think he wants a war in the Middle East, or at the very least, a long-term war, which is the reason why he came out immediately saying it's all gone, it's destroyed, it's obliterated. Because in his mind, I want this to be over with, I want to move on. Yeah. And as you point out, the Israelis were like, nope, we're not done. We're not done. We're going to rearm. We're going to reload. And even before the ceasefire was called, meaning they were begging for a ceasefire for all intents and purposes. And they were still saying, yeah, once we get a ceasefire, we're going to go with the Lebanon model, which is effectively we're going to continue the war under the guise of a ceasefire. So agreed, Israel was not backing away from this. And in their mind, they've shown proof of concept that they can get Donald Trump involved on their side of it, whether he knew in advance or not. So, the fact that, one last point, I strongly suspect that what Donald Trump did when he bombed those sites, I agree with you, it was theatrical, but I think it was theatrical in the sense of Israel wanting a ceasefire. And he needed to get across to Iran, get that ceasefire. That was his way of getting involved in order to try to get Israel out of the mess that it found itself in. Because after 12 days, and that was the other part I wanted to get into you with, the cost. Israel has taken a massive cost in this, which gets across that they didn't expect a war of attrition. Like they expected a short, blunt regime change. And they didn't get that. I definitely want to get your take on this. So right here, DD Geopolitics, they do fantastic work. I know I keep saying that, but they do. Bloomberg, citing Israeli finance minister, reports that the damage for the 12-day war reached $3 billion, with the idea that this could go up to $12 billion. So meaning they want to do a budget, I think, if I remember correctly, for 60 billion shekels. I haven't been to Israel in a while, so I don't remember the conversion, but basically, let's say $20-30 billion over the course of the year because of the costs of the war, the damage, and everything else. Right off the bat, though, they're expecting a $12 billion hit for 12 days. That's astonishing. That's $1 billion a day. Give me your take on that. Like, what does this mean? Is it just because if you're right, and I think you are, they want to do this again. Well, they couldn't afford to do it for 12 days, and yet they're planning already to go into another conflict. It seems contradictory.
It certainly seems irrational, but I think there's, the leadership of Israel are extremely hubristic, messianic fanatics. And I think that, as far as Israel is concerned, I think they're past the game over notice, Yeah. It's the whole Zionist project is unraveling. And I think that its only hope is to drag the United States into a regional war or a world war. So for them, the worse the better, because now if they just stopped, they would have to rebuild their ports. They would have to make peace with the Palestinians. They would have to allow for the Palestinian state to exist alongside Israel. They would have to probably give up on Gaza. It's all of their choices are a massive climb down from their maximalist ambitions. So politically, it's not going to happen. It can't happen. So they will always be inclined to escalate in order to make things so horrible that they will force the United States into a war on their side. And then there's a hope that you'll be able to pull other powers on your side as well. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the Kurds. Who knows? But this point, I think they're doing a lot of wishful thinking and a lot of hoping for things that can't happen, because even if today the United States came in on Israel's side, full hog, like with all of their assets that are available, they still couldn't defeat Iran. And these ideas like, oh, look how we took down Bashar al-Assad. Oh, look how we eliminated practically the whole leadership of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Oh, we can do the same in Iran. Hello? Iran is like 3 times the size of Syria.
Yeah.
92 million people. A huge army with hypersonic precision-guided missiles, with the whole axis of resistance still there that can be engaged, with millions of Palestinians in Jordan, like on the brink of overthrowing King Abdullah, with Egypt, whose military can't wait to go to war against against Israel. So there's so much stacked up against Israel, which is 100% completely dependent on the United States, Germany, Britain, and other European power, that what they're doing is completely suicidal. But it's worse than suicidal, because they want to drag us all into their war. And they're practically blackmailing the whole world with their Samson option. Yeah. Because they're saying, if we go down, you're all going down with us. And so you kind of can't ignore the situation and say, like, okay, you guys dug yourself into the hole, dig yourself out as best as you can. So it's a festering wound. Israel is finished. There's not going to be saving it. The question is whether it's going to be ended in like a quick and merciful way, or if it's going to be taken to a level of world war with nuclear weapons. So
now, why do you say it's finished? I'm curious. Dig into that for me. Is it the economics? Is it the issue of security? Meaning, this is supposed to be a safe space, and you have hundreds of thousands of people fleeing, basically, maybe not even coming back. Is it because the economy is in tatters? I mean, the economy wasn't even running during the course of the war. Like, they were effectively almost like somebody holding their breath underwater. Well, give me your take on it. Well, dig into it for me.
Well, it's all of these things that you mentioned. So Israel's economy is broken completely, and now 12 days of Iranian attacks, they lost all 3 ports. I don't know how long they're going to be out of commission, but allegedly they sustained very, very severe damage. And even if they repair them, we now know that Iran can do this again any day. So Iran can basically strangle Israeli economy at their will. They destroyed the Ben Gurion airport is out of commission. Iranians can accurately target their infrastructure. They didn't destroy, but they heavily inflicted heavy damage on the big oil refinery near Haifa.
Yeah, that's out until October, I believe. Or at the very least, their estimate is October.
Yes. And so you can't export, you can't import. Your people are deciding there's no future here anymore. We better get the hell out. So a lot of them are trying to leave. There's reports that in Cyprus, Israelis are trying to buy up whatever they can, to set themselves up to live there. Others are going back to the United States, Canada, wherever they came from. And so you're on a decline, and your security situation has proven to be so fragile that unless you resort to the nuclear option, you've actually sustained a strategic defeat. And this is not like a small crisis that you can easily reverse. So now, international investors, are they going to go back to Israel? It's very unattractive at the moment, and I don't know if that's going to change in any short interval from here. And so for that reason, I think that, and then all that aside, political situation in Israel is absolutely explosive. And all the shenanigans about Benjamin Netanyahu's court proceedings, the court cases against him, is further inflaming the political situation to the point where many in Israel believe that the country might slip into a civil war. So let's remember, they are a settler colony that's been created and contrived in the Middle East for the purposes of maintaining Western hegemony in the region. Mm-hmm. They are not sustainable. They're long term. They were able to be sustained there with very heavy economic, financial, military assistance from the Western powers. Very heavy propaganda in the West. The Western societies had to be continuously propagandized to support Israel. And all of this has now collapsed like a house of cards. And the country, a small country of 8-9 million people and shrinking, is surrounded by hostile powers. Hezbollah, a lot of Syrian society, or whatever factions are still there existing, are the enemies. The whole Iranian axis of resistance, Iran itself, Yemen, Egypt, and who knows, tomorrow it could be Jordan as well.
I'm curious on something. Why everything that you just said is perfectly rational and foreseeable? If security is one of the main points of, let's say, selling points of Israel, they went into war after war after war after war. Effectively, this idea of trying to create this greater Israel meant that you were in a perpetual war for nearly 2 years at this point, even going to the point of Iran. Meaning, even if you could get the United States involved, your country is going to get in tatters at this point, not to mention the people who are in the military who've been fighting these wars for the last 2 years. They didn't see this coming. Like, that's the part that's mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, but what does that tell you? That tells you that Israel was never set up to be the safe homeland for the Jewish people. It was always created as a battering ram for the Western Empire to cynically exploit the Jewish people, to wage war on everybody,
Yeah.
to the last Jew, to the last Israeli, if need be. You know, they don't care if they waste Israel completely, so long as they maintain their hegemony over the region so that they control trade and the resources of the region.
Mm-hmm.
If they kill every last Jew in the process, every last Israeli, they don't care. If they waste Israel completely, they don't care. It's the same as with Ukraine. You know, it's always imperialist, colonialist wars to keep everybody weak, exhausted, depleted, impoverished, in order for the Western financial centers to control the region with as little resources as necessary in terms of, you know, military intelligence work, corporate diplomatic control, and all of these things. Because then they just walk in, they say, well, we're going to help you out. We would just like to be able to invest in this sector or that sector, or your ports or airports, or, you know, national lottery, health system, preferably, all of these things. And then whatever happens to these societies, if they're completely, totally destroyed, impoverished, they couldn't care less, including Israelis. Well, remember, 5 years ago, they had no qualms about using the Israeli people as guinea pigs for Pfizer. And Benjamin Netanyahu himself was in Davos bragging about how he can offer Israel as the largest open air, real life experiment for the vaccines.
Yeah.
They don't care about the Israelis. That's, you know, they care about the Israelis about as much as they really care about the Iranian nuclear program. These are all just stories to sell to us. Oh, the Jewish people, they suffered. We have to protect them. They don't care. Oh, the Iranians, they have a nuclear program. We can't let that happen. It's too dangerous. We have to intervene. They don't care about that either. Freedom and democracy in Ukraine, same thing. It's always, you know, the repeat of the colonial imperialist wars for control of the resources, so that the plunder, there's, you know, like, so that there's no opposition to the plunder, so that the wealth extraction conveyor belt is well oiled, and that it doesn't rust anywhere, so that it just, you know, the financialized wealth from every part of the world just smoothly accrues to Western financial powers. And that's primarily the city of London and Wall Street, but then also Paris and other financial centers in the West.
Yeah. Is that what you think it was? That it was a gamble, kind of like in Ukraine, where it's, well, if we accomplish this, we'll be able to get their hands on the resources in Russia. Or in this case, if we can accomplish this, the government, well, the failed state of Iran, will be able to get our hands on the oil that is in Iran, which will pay for whatever we've expended in regards to this campaign. But in this case, it just failed. And so they're stuck with the hard costs of that failure.
Yes, that is part of the equation, but that's, you know, these are the proximate goals. Yeah. The ultimate goal is always, as you know, Halford Mackinder articulated it, to defend and secure Western hegemony of the whole Eurasian landmass. Because yes, you know, if you prevail in Ukraine, you're going to use Ukrainian resources to float up your financial system and to pay for the whole expense. If you prevail against Iran, of course you're going to help yourself to the Iranian resources. But, taking out Ukraine from Russia, taking the Iran from installing a Western-friendly regime is moving the whole Middle East to the Western
Yes.
to the Western powers. But then they would continue. They would
Russia and China.
continue to destabilize Russia.
Mm-hmm.
They would prevent the creation and development of this north-south international transport corridor, which is the alternative to the Suez route, the faster, cheaper, and more efficient trade route that goes from the Indian Ocean through Persian Gulf, across through 9 Iranian ports to the Caspian, and then all the way up to St. Petersburg. And from there, it can go to the Western world as well. So you wanna prevent that from happening and favor the trade routes that you think you're going to be controlling. And then if they manage to destabilize and weaken Russia enough to be able to install some Vladimir Zelensky in the Kremlin type leader, then the next thing is they would use Russia as the battering ram against China.
Yes.
They would take down China. And then, you dominate the whole Eurasian landmass. That has been the imperative. That has been the obsession of Western financial oligarchies for the last 200 years, if not more. Mm-hmm. So that's where we're at. And, Ukraine war was supposed to be an easy slam dunk against Russia. They thought they were going to provoke Russia into a quagmire, like they did in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Right.
They saw that, and then they were going to hit Russia with these nuclear sanctions, collapse its economy. And then they thought that Vladimir Putin's government was going to fall like the Soviet government, and they thought they had that in the pocket. It didn't happen that way. So then they had to start and detonate the events in the Middle East. So we got October 7, 2023, right? Mm-hmm. And it didn't trigger an immediate regional war, even though that was clearly the hope that they had, because the Iranians were very restrained. They didn't fall into any provocations. Bashar al-Assad was also very cautious. And so then it became necessary to take down Bashar al-Assad's government in order to be able to take down the Iranian government. It's all failing. Regime change against Iran is failing. Syria is probably going to be a very costly quagmire for them. And Russia is now stronger than it's been before, than it's ever been. And their alliance with China and their mutual support with Iran, Russia supporting Iran, China supporting Iran, these are new developments that a few years ago were not part of the equation. And also the cessation of hostilities between the cessation of a hostile relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran has also ended, and now they're allies and they mutually support one another. And so I think that what we're experiencing is the dying agony of the Western imperial system. But the battle is far from over. They're a wounded animal. They're very wounded animal, but they're very dangerous at that. And so it's going to continue to be bumpy and difficult, but I'm optimistic because I think that the Iranians, the Chinese, and the Russians have completely understood the Western game. They're not falling into cheap provocations. They're not reacting impulsively to events as they unfold. They're laser focused on their long-term security strategy, and they're prevailing. And Donald Trump is definitely, as much as one can criticize Donald Trump for a whole lot of reasons, he's definitely changing the course of US policy. And he's changing it away from imperial engagements towards multipolar integration. I know you're going to challenge me. Go.
I so disagree with you on that. I so disagree with you on that. All right, let's dig into that for a bit, for the time we have left. I know Donald Trump says he believes in multipolarity, but everything that he's doing is against multipolarity. So when he goes to Europe and says, I want you guys to put 5% in, it sounds like a diversification of resources. I need you all to deal with Europe while Israel deals with the Middle East, while we pivot to China. So in all three of the cases that you mentioned, is this kind of fulcrum of this kind of new multipolarity. You have a US administration that is doing everything in its power to try to deal with each of those issues. In fact, it's worse than that. I was going to bring out South Korea, where you get this attempted dictatorship that fails miserably, where they were trying to take over. They didn't trust the South Korean government. And so you have a situation where they were trying to create provocation with North Korea, even to the point of killing or disappearing some of its own people in order to make that provocation stick, with the notion being that the US gets control of South Korean military if there is a war, and that the US can pull that out. Now that matters for Ukraine. If indeed North Korean troops were fighting in Ukraine, they could then make the justification putting South Korean troops into that area. Serbia looks like it's undergoing a color revolution at this moment. You have Romania, looked like it was undergoing a color revolution. Like, all of these places seem to be aspects that I would say empire, meaning the US, looks out at and says, okay, we are overextended. And so Europe, we need you to deal with the Ukraine issue or the Russia issue. We, Israel, our client, our proxy, we need you to deal with the issue in the Middle East. To your point, this didn't work though. I strongly suspect that Donald Trump was probably told Israel can do it, and Israel couldn't do it. Just like Joe Biden believed Ukraine could do it, and Ukraine couldn't do it. Give me your take on that, because I don't see Trump as pivoting away from hegemony. I see him as doubling down on hegemony while maybe using the words or terminology of multipolarity.
Yeah, so there's the possibility that everything he's doing is a big elaborate deception to make it appear like he's pivoting away from the empire, but he's actually doubling down. That's possible. However, Donald Trump has been consistent in his rhetoric and his signaling, in his positioning on this issue for, I would say, since the beginning, ever since he got into politics before the 2016 elections. Mm-hmm. I have to ask myself, why would he do any of that if he didn't mean it? Because if you see, as a billionaire, he could have stayed out of politics completely, contented himself to be a big donor to the DNC, a big donor to the RNC, and then to be the recipient of the state largesse, we can allow you, you can do this and you can do that, and we'll give you this government contract, and you can go develop, resorts in Saudi Arabia and everywhere where, like he could, if it were about money, he would have done a lot better if he stayed out of politics and just contented himself to be a donor to all these people and left it at that. He went into politics. The United States has already been the enforcement arm of the Western Empire since Harry Truman.
Yes.
At least, right? But with Harry Truman, it's become practically the undisputed national policy. And it's practically never been challenged. It's been challenged by, JFK, but we know how that ended. And so, if he went into politics and he said, business as usual, I'm going to continue the enforcement of hegemony, he wouldn't have political enemies at all. He wouldn't go through 8 years of investigations, demonizations 24/7 in the media, multiple impeachment hearings, 2 assassinations attempt, and so on. He would have been the darling of the establishment. And let's face it, the most powerful parts of that establishment are those who have benefited the most from the United States being the enforcement arm of the empire. And this is exactly the people who are going to be his enemies if he challenges their privilege. Mm-hmm. So he can't just go and, like JFK, say, hey, guess what? Your thing is over. There's going to be a change in course. He has to, if he wants to live, he has to be deceptive about this, and he has to be tricksy about it. And he has to make both sides think at the same time that he might be currying favor with them. It's almost, he's almost like in a position of being an undercover cop where, the drug cartel thinks he's their guy, and all the other people think that he's the drug cartel guy, so that nobody suspects what's coming. But let's see. If we're 50-50, either he's a grand deceiver who's just going to double down on the American empire, or he's a new George Washington or new Benjamin Franklin who wants the United States to be a republic and embrace multipolarity. Then the next clue I look for is how are the Russians and how are the West Europeans reacting to all this? And the Western Europeans, they couldn't hate him more if they tried. They're at the same time, they are being horrible brown nosers. Like it's vomit inducing to what extent they're brown nosing Trump, but at the same time they absolutely hate him. And if you read European newspapers, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, he's doing deals with China, he's doing deals with the Russians, and the Russian political establishment, they're all saying, no, we think that Trump is sincere. We want him to be successful. We're dealing with him, and we think we're going to do good things together with Trump. It's plausible that they're signaling like this also out of some complex psyop reason. But, I'm looking at the way things are happening on the ground. The United States really did extricate itself from Ukraine. And the United States is no longer even pretending that they're going to give security guarantees to Ukraine.
Right.
It is a massive blow to the empire, like an absolutely massive blow to the empire. Europeans, if they spent 50% of their GDP, could not replace the United States in time to reverse Ukraine's defeat. Mm-hmm. And then he was supposed to go to war against Iran and take down the Iranian regime. Well, the jury's still out, but it hasn't happened yet. And it does seem to me that he's trying to avoid going to war against Iran. So we'll see. But I tend to think that he's for real. And that's the reason why the British establishment, the European political establishment, the EU, not, people like Viktor Orban and Robert Fico and people like that, but the actual all banking oligarchy political establishment, that absolutely rabidly hate Donald Trump. And he just announced a deal with a trade deal with the Chinese. Mm-hmm. The Chinese are paying attention. Would they deal with him if they thought he was like Joe Biden? I don't know. I understand why it's not easy to believe this, and it's not easy for me either. But on balance of evidence, I tend to think that he is sincere about multipolar integrations, and that he's not sincere about the empire.
The Roman Empire, at one point, when it was overextended, started bringing in barbarians, quote unquote, into their ranks in order to fill out their ranks when they realized they couldn't necessarily carry it on their own. And I guess I consider Trump is doing something similar. Yes, he's making deals, but when Hegseth goes to Shangri-La and makes that speech where he's effectively declaring war on China, effectively saying we'll militarily defend Taiwan, and was trying to blackmail all of those other states to help the U.S. in going after China. Okay, that doesn't sound like multipolarity to me. That sounds like, again, hegemony through other means. Or when Vance goes into Europe and makes that speech, basically browbeating many of the Europeans. And by the way, they deserved it, so fair enough on that front. But this doesn't come across as multipolarity. This comes across even the tariff war, where Trump is asserting U.S. power in an economic sense. He just wasn't able to assert the power that he thought the United States had at its disposal. And so in one sense, you get what I think you would even agree with me, an attempted takeover of the Middle East by a U.S. proxy that Trump himself acknowledged that they knew what was going on as they were going about the regime change. And in Europe, where the U.S. is just sick of paying, $300 billion to a war that we lost, meaning Trump is acknowledging losing. I don't know if Donald Trump was winning that war, Donald Trump wouldn't be pulling out of that war. It's just, okay, this is a fool's errand. This isn't working. Europe, you need to attend to your affairs. Europe's issue is that daddy is leaving, or that daddy wants to at the very least pull out in the way that daddy was there prior. Whereas Joe Biden was full-throated in its support. But if you remember, Joe Biden even didn't want to give security guarantees to Ukraine. He never did. He could have, but he never did. The U.S. doesn't want to end up in a large-scale war with Russia in a nuclear sense, because that's effectively where it would go. And so I understand where you're coming from, but I don't think this is five-dimensional chess. I think this is kind of a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. That the U.S., recognizing that it's overextended, is trying to find ways to have hegemony by other means, believing that it could work through Europe, work through Israel, work through, these states in the Pacific to go after China, which is where we want to ultimately pivot to, is China. Does it make sense, or do you disagree with that? Like, give me your take on that. Do you think? Give me your take on that first.
It's simply impossible to be certain about it. Everything you laid out, it may turn out that you're right, but I've with Trump, I've kind of learned to ignore the rhetoric and to watch what actually happens.
Yeah.
Because if you remember a few years ago, well, in his first term, the rhetoric between Trump and North Korea became so ugly.
It's off the wall.
You thought that there's going to be war between the United States and South Korea and North Korea. But at the very same time, when he was calling Kim Jong-un a rocket man and saying, like, my rockets are bigger than your rockets, all this juvenile nonsense, he actually sent high-level representatives of the U.S. military, like high-level generals. He sent them to China and to South Korea, I believe, to prepare the ground for peace negotiations with North Korea. And then he went to North Korea himself. And he, for the first time since forever, reestablished good relationships between U.S. and North Korea, with the view of brokering peace between North and South. And if you'll remember, he and Kim Jong-un got along very well. And it looked like North and South Korea were going to make peace. And in fact, they started demining the demilitarization zone, which was before Trump. It was like an unthinkable development. Of course, it all ultimately collapsed because he was being, but like even Trump during his term, he was being sabotaged practically at every turn in foreign policy, and he wasn't able to get very much done. And also then, if you remember, in 2017, there was a really, really ugly moment with Syria, where he wasn't able to avoid intervening in Syria. So what he did is he fired off, like, I think 56 Tomahawks or whatever missiles at Syria. But the way he did it is he pre-announced it to the Russians an hour in advance. He told them, here's what we're going to do, which enabled the Russians to shoot. Well, there's two stories: that the Russians shot down about half of them, but the other story was that the Russians deliberately stood down their air defense systems, but all the missiles landed in an empty lot in Syria. They weren't targeting anything of any importance. Mm-hmm. So he did, he did a big show for the PR effect at home, kind of like the same thing with Iran this time. Yep. To no effect. It didn't damage the Bashar al-Assad's regime in the slightest. So, I want to see what happens. But the fact that Trump extricated the United States from Ukraine, that is the most important battlefield for the Western Empire. Like, more important than Israel, more important than the Middle East. Because remember, Mackinder said, who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland. Who controls the heartland controls the world island, the Eurasian landmass. And who controls the world island controls the world. To control the world, you have to control Eastern Europe, i.e., Ukraine there is absolutely pivotal. And if you look at so many Western establishment people, political and military leaders and diplomatic leaders, so many of them, like the Polish president Morawiecki said, if we lose in Ukraine, we're going to lose the world for generations. Boris Johnson said, if we lose Ukraine, it's going to be the end of Western hegemony in the world. And, you had further, NATO and British officials who said essentially the exact same thing. So Ukraine has been the most important thing for them. And Trump said, not interested. I'm not doing it. I'm not fighting this war for you. I want to talk to Vladimir Putin and I want to do deals with the Russians. So he's actually doing that. The rhetoric, Pete Hegseth giving speeches, I kind of have to not react to that because I'm at this point, the rhetoric is inflicting brain injuries to me. Right. Brain injuries from it. I have to ignore the rhetoric. I want to wait and see what actually happens.
Last question. A lot of this stuff comes across as desperation to me. I mean, I agree with you with the whole, in part, because Donald Trump is still sending money to Ukraine. He's still involved. He's trying to act like a negotiator while simultaneously being party to the conflict. He could have always walked. He hasn't chosen to do that. And he's already talked about putting more sanctions. We don't even know if there's going to be another budget going to Ukraine. It doesn't seem like it is, or if there is, it's going to be much less. But the Lend-Lease, I'm calling it Lend-Lease, mineral deal, there are provisions of the mineral deal where we don't even know, like elements of it hasn't even been sent to the RADA for them to even review. So it comes across as a way for him to give weapons without giving weapons, where he can make an argument that they're buying weapons, which is a way of them maintaining the conflict. But like I said, we'll see. We'll see when the budget comes up and what goes to Ukraine in that sense. But I guess my larger point is a lot of this stuff comes across as desperation. Is it just from the Western point of view that if we just don't do anything, if we allow momentum to take its course, that ultimately hegemony loses? that this idea of the West maintaining control of the globe fails when China, India, Brazil, Russia, Iran, all of these countries basically come into their own in a way that the West can't compensate. So you have wars. You have, okay, we need to go after the Russians. We need to go after the Iranians. We need to go after the Chinese using Taiwan. We need to get South Korea involved by going overthrowing that government and turn it into a dictatorship. Even what's taking place in Serbia right now looks like a color revolution. What was taking place in, I believe it was Romania. What was Romania? No, not Romania. It was, what was it? It's not Romania. It's not Slovakia. It'll come to me in a moment, but where effectively the French-born, I call her spook or spy, who was president, was running. Georgia, thank you. Where they were effectively trying to have a color revolution in Georgia. Like all of this stuff was happening almost simultaneously, which doesn't seem to be random to me. Is this just empire freaking out in a certain sense of desperation?
Yeah, that's exactly it, Jamal. The empire is freaking out because they're losing. You know, I think that in the last 5 years, they had 3 mega projects that they launched, and they failed at all 3 of them. The first one was the COVID pandemic, because that one was aimed at the whole entire planet, at the populations of not just the global South, but even the Western populations. We were supposed to be brought into a new normal where we would enjoy liberties as a privilege for compliance with basically whatever they say. It was the vaccines were going to start the process to get us to kind of acquiesce because, it's for the health, it's for, public safety. And so, of course, we're going to go around with these QR codes certifying that we're compliant. But, then they're going to say like, oh, did you shave your mustache today? No, you didn't. You can't go in the restaurant, whatever. They were obviously preparing a large scale infrastructure of control where they could condition your access to whatever, restaurants, airplanes, trains, internet, social media, by your compliance on, whatever they decide. So that failed. They were promising us that the old normal was never coming back. Well, we're kind of in an old normal today. Back, at least in the sense that you can go on a train, you can go in a plane. There's these control schemes didn't come alive really. The second,
and by the way, let's interrupt real quick. I don't even think they could do that again today. I think they would have a hard time.
I very much doubt it, because remember when it started in 2020, in the early 2020, the Western population, the global population was so completely unprepared. Everybody still thought that all these, World Health Organizations and, Gavi, that Bill Gates was a good guy trying to save the world. And, people were just not even prepared for the idea that their governments could actually do such evil, sinister things. I think that changed for a very substantial segment of the population today. So I think that bringing it back is not going to work. So the second mega project was Ukraine. They were going to collapse Russia, regime change it, and then they were going to move on to Iran and China easily. So that failed. And the third mega project is Middle East, which is not going so well. They're not done, but so far the government of Iran has survived. The people of Iran, 92 million people, most of them has rallied around the government. The country is more united than it has been probably since the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. And they have shown the ability to inflict a strategic defeat against their enemy, being Israel. And I think that inevitably the Pentagon has taken note. If they can do this to Israel, they can do the same to every single one of our military bases. and they can do the same to our naval assets in the region. So this is never going to be a cakewalk. This is no Taliban. This is no Ansar Allah, and they were defeated by both Taliban and Ansar Allah. But this is a far, far, far more powerful enemy. It's a huge nation. Just consider that the Russians are having a very hard time defeating Ukraine, which, they're territorially there. They have the escalatory dominance. Ukraine is less than half the population of Iran. Their military is less than half of the military of Iran. And it's still a difficult, and it's an unpopular government.
Yeah.
And the Russians are still going 2.5 years of that war, and they still haven't defeated entirely the armed forces of Ukraine. What is the hope of the West defeating Iran, which is much, much larger, with much, much bigger army, which has been preparing itself for the
years
against the West for more than 20 years now, and has very powerful allies, not just the axis of resistance in the region, but also China and Russia. So I think that the two big projects failed. The third one is in the process of failing. So yes, they are freaking out. And so they're starting to arson attacks. Oh, let's orchestrate a terror attack in the Kashmir, because that's one of the obvious flashpoints where you could destabilize the whole region and cause a big war. The Balkans are definitely one of the next flashpoints for Europe, because the Royal United Services Institute in London, which is their main foreign policy think tank, has actually declared that the Balkans are inevitably the next front in the West's conflict between Russia and the West. So they are, the British diplomacy and secret services and all these different NGOs, they're very, very active in Bosnia. Some of the same players that were very active in Syria before they orchestrated the regime change attack, they are now working on Bosnia. And so, part of the game is to destabilize Serbia and to drag Serbia into a war where, Russia might have to come in as a supporting Serbia. And then they've kind of maneuvered Croatia, Albania, and Bulgaria into a military alliance. The three countries have nothing to do one with another, strategically, ethnically, culturally, religiously, nothing in common whatsoever. Yet they've been thrown into an alliance. But what they have in common is that they surround Serbia, Croatia to the west, Albania to the south, Bulgaria to the east. So they're trying, they're trying to surround Serbia to when this war gets going, so that they create a massive mess that probably will make it impossible for Hungary to stay out, for Russia to stay out, and possibly for NATO to stay out. So then again, you're going to have a war in the heart of Europe. Let's remember, World War II was triggered in Sarajevo.
Yes, it was.
And the British diplomacy and secret services are very, very active in Sarajevo. They're active in the media, in the public relations domain, in education domain, and in security policy. The secret services, the interior ministry, they're very, very active in dealing in all those domains. And I think that when the British establishment says we are here to ensure peace and stability, they mean exactly the opposite. They always, the British always say the opposite of what they actually mean. I'm not talking British like, John Waters. No, sorry, Roger Waters, or,
You don't want the British government.
No,
Yeah.
I'm talking about the British foreign policy establishment, those people. Stalin noticed that when the British say white, they actually mean black. And when they say up, they actually mean down. And so this is always the case. I mean, to the point where, you know, in the UK, the public schools are private and the private schools are public. So it goes, it's like, it's an insane thing, but that's basically how it is. And so anyway, you know, going back to your point, that they're freaked out and they're trying to start fires wherever they can. You know, they're going to get Finland into war with Russia, the Baltic states, if they can. They're going to try to get India and Pakistan. They're going to try to get Bangladesh with Myanmar, get something going there. North Korea, South Korea. They're going to try to get something going with Taiwan if they can, which they probably won't be able to. But anyway, you know, they're gonna keep destabilizing it as much as they can. And obviously, then, you know, they're going to continue to try to regime change Iran, and they're not going to give up on bringing back this story about the Iranian nuclear program, which is just a pretext again.
Alex, thank you for this. Honestly, great breakdown. I swear. I always enjoy these conversations. The audience always enjoys these conversations. Alex Krainer, he's founder of Krainer Analytics and creator of iSystem Trend Following. He has worked as a market analyst, researcher, trader, and hedge fund manager since 1996. He has authored several books, including Mastering Uncertainty in Commodities Trading, The Grand Deception, Alex Krainer, Trends Following Bible. You have a fantastic day, man. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Jamal. You too, and greetings to your listeners.
Alrighty, have a good one. Bye-bye. Oh, fantastic.